are hoping to record. We're hoping to record this session and are recording this session. If anyone is uncomfortable with that, please let us know now. Are we seeing any hand raises? Okay, I'll keep moving on. So just as a reminder, the training today is using data for grant writing. So we are going to be talking about what a grant is, what some different types of grants are, how to use data in your grant writing, some common elements of grant proposals, and then specifically the needs statements of grant proposals and what goes into those, and then how you want to paint the picture and weave all of this information together. And then we'll have time for questions and that evaluation I mentioned at the end. So to get us started, just thinking through what is a grant. It is typically a financial award that's given by an entity like the government or a foundation to an individual or company to fund the achievement of a goal or to put a mission or vision into action. So obtaining a grant typically includes writing up the story of your organization and demonstrating the needs of the communities you serve with data, both numbers and visuals. So data is really a key component of good grant writing.
Yeah, so I'll take it here and just talk about some different types of grants that are out there. I'll start with source funds. So there are different types of source funds. The first I'm going to talk about here are the government kind. So there's local and state. So for those of us that are in the Seattle area, local would be grants from the city of Seattle, King County, versus funds from the state of Washington. There are also source funds from foundations. So there are family foundations. An example of this would be the Belinda and Melinda Gates Foundation locally. There are public and private funds. Another local example would be the Seattle Foundation, and community funds that are specific to a geographic area. So another one would be Rainier Valley Community Development Fund. There's also a couple of funds that are less common for nonprofits. One would be a corporate fund. So that would be from a corporate business, like let's say Coca-Cola giving grants for COVID, or maybe Patagonia, the outdoors brand, providing grants for nonprofits that work helping the environment. And there's also federated grants. So those are funds that are raised from businesses and local company workers to then distribute to nonprofits. Another local example would be Boeing has a program that gives out federated funds. But again, corporate and federated source funds are typically less common for nonprofits. Types of grants could also be grouped by the use of funds. So there's building or capital grants. So those are grants that are particularly focused on helping with a single initiative, helping fund the groundwork, building repairs, improvements, or just a one-time expense for a nonprofit. There's technology, IT, or software grants. So those are typically tech grants that are offered by companies or corporate giants to help nonprofits develop their IT skills with different software and different technology. There's capacity building grants. So those are really about strengthening an organization's infrastructure, management, or governance. Things like program evaluation, strategic planning, or even setting up a volunteer management system. And we ourselves, the Capacity Collective, believe it or not, get a capacity building grant, and we're funded by that. And lastly, we have general operational grants. So those cover things like employment, administrative elements, and sometimes equipment. And those are generally used to address urgent issues. So why use data in grant writing? Funders really see data as evidence in the case that you are making for your program. So data gives your reader / funder a deeper understanding of the population or the populations that you serve and how they will benefit from your unique approach. Data establishes a baseline for comparisons when your program makes impacts. Using follow-up data and grant reports is a great way to show the impacts of your work and show changes to the groups you serve over time. And lastly, funders are more likely to fund projects or organizations that use quality data rather than just gut feelings or a general instinct. So how is data used in grant writing typically? So you can use data points to can define the extent of relevant problems for the people your program serves. So it can help narrow down the scope of the problem. It demonstrates knowledge about the people you serve. And the people you serve can be multiple communities across culture, race, age, or other demographics, as we are all intersectional. Data can help explain the efficacy of the approach proposed. So in other words, how well will your solution work for the communities that you serve? And data can demonstrate that your organization is the one who can make the impact on the issue. So data will help show that you understand the problem well and how to solve it in ways that others cannot. So where can you get this magical data? There are publicly available websites. So websites like the Census, Washington State has its own website, King County has its own website, the city of Seattle has its own website that has a number of dashboards and reports that you can pull information from. You can use internal information. So what patterns have you and your staff observed? To figure that out, you can look at case notes, you can look at client surveys, staff surveys, or even intake forms that you have in your programs. And you can plan ahead. So you can collect data now to help build the case to your funders. So specific data points that you can begin collecting could be family demographic or geographic information. Where are they located? What communities are they a part of? Generally, what participation numbers do you have in your program? Are you collecting testimonials? A little bit later, we'll talk more about qualitative data and what that can look like in your reporting, in your grant writing. Also referrals or different types of services that your program provides. All right, well, our break came up a little bit sooner than we anticipated, Janae.
I know you just got here, but so we will actually take like a 1-minute break. I don't know if folks need it. Like Araceli said, it came up a bit quicker. So we'll just kind of hang out for a minute or so, and then we'll dive back in. All right, what do you say we keep going? I know that wasn't a very long break, but we also just got started. So what do you say we continue? So now that we know a bit about grants at large, let's actually dive into the proposal itself. So most grant proposals have many elements, but today we're only going to be discussing 3. We're going to be discussing the abstract, the institutional background, and the needs statement. And we're not necessarily saying that these are the most important, but they are the most common places that you're going to use data in your proposal. Some other elements in the application will likely include goals, objectives, and outcomes, methods, implementation, the evaluation plan, the sustainability plan, the budget, and finally, the timeline. But let's define these key three that we're going to talk about today. So the first is the abstract. The abstract is a brief overview of your proposal. It usually identifies your goals, the needs, the methods you plan to use, etc. And it gives the reader, like I said, a high-level overview of what to even expect in your proposal. It highlights the need and then how those in need will benefit. So typically it's the first thing that your reader sees, but it's the last thing you as the grant writer are going to write, because your abstract summarizes the entirety of the proposal. So you don't want to write it too soon. You want to make sure that it's the last thing you write so it accurately reflects what you've put in your proposal. And this is an area where you're going to want to be sure that you pull in all that standout data. The next is the institutional background, and these are just details about your organization, including location, your mission and vision, and your expertise. In this area, you're going to want to be sure that you highlight your past successes. You really need to brag about your organization. When the reader is looking at your application, they need to know right out of the gate that you are the most qualified, and you need to establish your credibility. You need to pull in any relevant data that you have about your organization, including staff demographics and current outcomes. And then finally, and the one that we're going to be spending a bit of time with today, the needs statement. So the needs statement explains the gap in knowledge, resources, or opportunity, and then connects those needs and the gap directly back to the funder's goals and priorities. So it documents with evidence what the need is, what the problem is, who is in need, and how you know they are in need. And this is where the data comes in. So you need to use data to strengthen your needs assessment or your needs statement and tell a good story. Your needs statement has to tell a good story, or otherwise you're just putting numbers and words on a page. So in order to tell a good story, you need to be careful that you're not being too vague or too broad. You need to be specific about your geographic areas that you serve and work within. You need to give a clear sense of urgency. The funder needs to know that this is a problem now, not a problem that you anticipate. You need to demonstrate that your program has the right approach. They need to know that not only do you identify this as a problem, but you are situated in a space that allows you to help address that problem. And then finally, you need to show off your expertise with data. In addition, your needs statement needs to answer the critical questions of the proposal. And the funder needs to know the answers to these questions in order to accurately assess your need. And so you need to identify what the need is, and you need to be explicit, not we think or we hope, or it needs to be a very clearly identified need. You also need to identify who is in need, and not just who, where they are, what their demographics are, what neighborhood are they in, what city are they in. And then you need to also highlight when the need is evident and how do you even know that it's a problem. It's also important that you are clear about what are the consequences of not meeting this need. So this population is in need of something, but what are the consequences of that not being met? You need to highlight that there is a sense of urgency. And finally, you need to be able to show the funder why the need is linked to your organization and highlight your qualifications. So we're going to put this into practice a little bit. So in the next few slides, we're going to review some best practices or some do less of this, more of this. And I'm hoping that that can really start to contextualize what we mean by using data in your grant proposal. So our hope is that these best practices will help you to more clearly and directly respond to a funder's request and tell a good story. At the end of the day, if you can't just tell your funder that you're in need, you have to show them. So let's walk through this example together. So let's say that your organization is seeking funding to develop a parenting support group for immigrant and refugee mothers in King County. I think it's a scenario that some of you might relate to, and I definitely know we have some programs out there that do similar things. So just keep this example in mind as we go through the next few slides. So the first thing that you need to do to have a strong needs statement and to use data within your application is to use specific data. You need to avoid using generalized data that does not apply to the focus population. So for example, in your application, if you were to say 35% of parents in Washington state identify lack of support as a leading stressor in becoming a new parent. Okay, that's great. What it doesn't do is it does not apply specifically to the need of immigrant and refugee mothers in King County. So while it's a good example, it's a bit too broad for the population that you are trying to identify as being in need. So instead, you need to use data that is specific to your organization and the focus population that you've identified. So you don't want to tell your funder what is needed at large, but you want to tell them what is needed by your program, your clients, and your community. So to change the way that you would present this data, you could say, in our latest organizational needs assessment, 68% of immigrant parent participants reported wanting more emotional and/or community support. So what this does is that it takes it to a personal level. The more personal the data, the more personal the story. So rather than say, in general, parents in Washington need more support, you are saying parents in this focus population that I have identified have said they need support. So you're being specific and you're directly backing up what your parents are asking for. Sorry, we had a glitch in slides. The next thing that you need to make sure that you do is use timely data. So avoid using data or program outcomes that were collected more than 5 years ago, unless you are making comparisons. So for example, doing less of this is, in 2014, our program served over 200 immigrant and refugee children and families. So this data is a bit outdated. And in using outdated data, that there is a chance that you are not representing the need that is you are describing in your proposal. So if your proposal is requesting support for current clients, but the data that you're using in your example is 10 years ago, or I guess in this case, 8 years ago, your data might not be telling the story that you think it is. And I guess that's not to say that older data isn't valuable. You need to use what you have, but just be mindful of how long ago it was collected. So instead, we urge you to use data or program outcomes that are recent, and typically the best practices within the last 5 years. So changing the example up a bit, you could say, last year, our program served 355 immigrant and refugee families in King County, a 31% increase over the past 6 years. So when you use current data and present it in a way that supports and demonstrates the urgency, it's also more specific. If you are asking for funding to develop a parenting program for a specific population, you have to demonstrate why your organization is qualified to do so. And by showing that there has been an increase in populations served, you are showing the funder that there is a sense of urgency. So this is actually a bonus. So this example is particularly good for using visuals in your grant application. So using the example from the last slide, the quote or the statistic of last year, our program served 355 immigrant and refugee families in King County, a 31% increase over the past 6 years. So this statement on its own is effective. I wouldn't say don't use it. It's specific, it's timely, and it even makes a good comparison. But when you use a visual, it's even more powerful. So just at a quick glance, you can see the upward trend showing you really quickly that over time, the number of immigrant and refugee families served at your organization has continued to increase over time. That supports your needs statement and gives your organization a valid reason for requesting funds. But we just want to put in like a little caveat of don't overuse visuals in your grant application. Just use them to highlight the important parts or really pull out the key data pieces that you're trying to demonstrate. And then also make sure that you label your visuals and make sure that they're very clear and match the overall theme of the application. You don't want it to look like an infographic. You still want it to look like a grant application, but having visuals in there will make you stand out. And then finally, and this is an ask, a request, kind of a very strong best practice, and that is using ethical cited data. So you need to avoid using borrowed data, and borrowed data is really any data that is from outside your organization and using that without citing your sources. So you need to be mindful of making statements that do not belong to you. If you find information that is not a result of your internal data, you need to be sure to cite it. So for the example, if you were to say 1 in 7 immigrant families have children once they arrived in the United States. On its own, I mean, that's a fine statement, but you can't use that without saying where it came from, or your reader might assume that it's from your organization, or they may assume that you're using, untrue statements. So instead, you want to make sure that you use data that is citable and makes sense into the context of your grant proposal. And it also needs to give clear credit to the original source. So you could change this exact statement by saying, a recent study found that 1 in 7 immigrant families have children once they arrive in the United States, cited the University of Washington 2020. If you're trying to make the point that immigrant families have children in the US could lead to an increased need in resources, you can use the borrowed data to make that point. You just need to make sure that it's cited, credible, and as recent as possible. And using ethical and cited data goes beyond using academic or borrowed data. It also includes other forms of qualitative data that your organization is probably already collecting. Most of you have said, I don't think that we're actually collecting qualitative data, and nearly all of you are. And qualitative data comes in many different forms. So it comes in the form of case notes, satisfaction surveys, conversations with clients, video or in-person interviews. Anytime you're interacting with a client, truly you're collecting data. Data is not just in the form of numbers, it also is in the form of words and stories and testimonials. So what does that look like in a grant application? How would you incorporate that into a grant application? So here's an example of how you could do that. So reading the screen. Last year, our organization conducted a client satisfaction survey with families receiving services. Clients were asked to report on other services they wish were provided by our organization. One respondent replied, I wish I could talk to other moms like me about my experience. I often feel isolated in my parenting. And that is a program participant age 27. So using qualitative data in your grant application is really powerful. You just need to make sure that you're doing it right. And this example personalizes your proposal. It provides evidence, it aligns with your overarching need, and it tugs at the heartstrings just a bit. Because grant writing, while it is a lot about demonstrating the need with data, also reaching the kind of hearts and minds of those reading your proposal. So the way that you are going to properly incorporate qualitative data into your application is to make sure that you are doing it correctly. And doing it correctly means that it's all about confidentiality. So when you're using qualitative data in your application, always, always be mindful of confidentiality. And that can come in many forms. So the first is that having a release of information or permission to share documentation on file is best practice. I know that many of you have this, but if you do not have this on file and you are using client information, especially that qualitative data in applications, and it is identifiable, that is not good. So please make sure that you have release of information on file for clients. The next is being transparent in your data collection and data use practices. So not only is it transparent about your staff, why are we collecting this data, how do we use it internally, but it's sharing with your participants what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and then how you're using it. Also be sure that you are changing names and any identifying information. So in the example I provided in the previous slide, it was identified as program participant age 27. So unless your program only has one 27-year-old, chances are that is not identifiable information. But you'll just want to be very mindful of making sure if someone in the community reads this, knows they're from my organization, are they going to be identified? And so you'll always just be very mindful and careful with that. And when you're using qualitative data, quotes specifically, keep people anonymous. Never use their name. You can use fake names, or you can just say program participant. And then finally, if you do not have these measures in place and you do not have permission from the program participants, use aggregate data. So rather than say this person and this person and this person, you will say our program at large. So you kind of summarize the happenings in your program as opposed to identifying individual people. So that about wraps up all the things you need to know about a needs statement. I hope you're all ready to run out and tell funders about the things that you need. I am going to hand it over to Bethany, and she is going to show you how to tie it all together.
Yeah, great. So now after all of that information, it's time to think about how you would bring this together. So when you sit down to start writing a grant proposal, you really want to think about the best way to paint the picture of what you need, for whom, and why you need it. And so the first step in that is thinking about how you'll weave the intellect or the data and the emotion. So this is another way of saying incorporate both head and heart to convey the importance of your grant proposal. So using those personal stories is great. That gets at the heart, but you need to back it up with data. You also want to present information in a logical order. So I think we've all probably read something that flowed really well and took us seamlessly from point A to point B. And that's really what you're striving for with grant writing. I often, when I'm writing a grant proposal, I think about the stack of proposals or applications that a certain grant writer is having to read through as I write it, because I want to make it as easy as possible for that person to get through my application, understand what I need, why I need it, and easily and hopefully pick my application. And then on that same note, you really want to engage the reader. So you want to help them understand why your proposal, the topic of your proposal, is important. So in addition to that logical flow and order, you want to keep reiterating why that topic is so important, again, by using those personal stories backed by data. So there are 6 really important aspects to consider when you're writing a grant proposal, the first 3 of which are great places to add your data. The first being describing the problem. So we already touched on this, but again, it's that who, what, where, when, and why. You also want to talk about why the problem you're suggesting is a problem is actually a problem. And then what will happen to the population served, the community, or society in general if this problem is not resolved. Additional aspects that you'll want to weave in here that you might not necessarily have data to reinforce, but they're just important dimensions to complete the picture, are addressing challenges or barriers that you might face in addressing the problem. You also want to discuss why the problem needs to be addressed now, and if there's anything currently being done about the problem, and if so, why that is falling short of what needs to happen. And then you also want to be realistic about what you're proposing to accomplish in the time frame of the grant. As I'm sure you've all seen, some grants are for 3 months, some are for 5 years. You need to adjust your plan accordingly. And then finally, as we keep coming back to, provide those real examples of how a problem is affecting someone's life and how your proposed program or solution will have an impact on their life. So make it real for the readers. Let them see that it's not just the numbers that you're carefully weaving in, but that it actually has this real heart tug human interest component. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to walk through an example of using data in a needs statement. And this example is just a snippet of a needs statement, but it'll provide a good example of how you can weave data in. So it doesn't have all of the components that Janae walked through earlier. We couldn't fit all of that on the screen, to be honest. But this is from a grant proposal we submitted to Snohomish County to research racial and ethnic equity issues related to that county's COVID-19 response. And I think we'll go one sentence at a time just so it's not overwhelming. Okay, similar to national findings, data from Snohomish County shows racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 cases, deaths, and vaccination rates. The majority of Snohomish County residents identify as non-Hispanic white, and 37% identify as people of color. According to Snohomish Health District's most recent data from November of 2021, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities are 4 times more likely to be infected with COVID-19 and to be hospitalized for COVID-19, and 2.5 times as likely to die from COVID-19 than non-Hispanic whites. The Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community within Snohomish County has been working tirelessly to reach the overlooked and underserved members of their community. Through grassroots efforts, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community members and leaders have achieved a nearly 100% COVID-19 vaccination rate. Despite this, rates of infection and death remain high. So you can see here that we're using county data, we're using census data, but we're telling the story and we're pulling out the exact population we want to look at, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, what the problem is, why it's a problem, and then, of course, as I said, it doesn't go into everything, but then we would want to talk about how our organization is connected to this population, the work we've done with them previously, and how we're proposing to help in this, what our proposed solution is. Okay, so now that you've seen an example, we created a little Mad Lib type activity that I'm hoping we can all do together. And we're just going to put up, again, kind of sentence by sentence, some things that we can fill in as just an exercise in how you can weave data into your proposals. So if there's anyone brave that wants to call out a problem, and then we can all go through together, either using chat or unmute yourself, to just guess at percentages and numbers for the point of this exercise. But of course, when it comes to the real thing, don't guess with your data, use actual data. Okay, so does anyone have a problem? And I guess I'll preface this by saying this can be a silly problem, or we could actually do, like, I know my example is serious, but if you just have a silly problem, we can go through it that way too. Somebody brave. Oh, great. Okay, so Ben says in King County, so we'd say halitosis in King County affects 27% of residents and disproportionately affects residents of Garlic Gulch. Great. Araceli, would you put the next sentence up? Thanks. So this rate surpasses that of, could we say the state or nationally? Halitosis is new to me, so what do other people think? So we would say the rate surpasses that of the state and potentially nationally. So we could say if we had a percentage there of what the rate nationally is, we could follow that by a percent or a number, making it an even more critical area of concern. Without further intervention, halitosis will become an even greater concern for residents of King County, potentially resulting in, what are some, no, Ben, this was a great example. I just, what are some of the problems that will result if we do not fix halitosis in King County or Garlic Gulch? Extreme social distancing, good. Continued mask wearing, perhaps. Less laughter. Yeah. More bad dates. Okay, what's the next sentence? In order to help address halitosis, then your organization names here plans to, and then what are some of the things we could do? Oh, right. So higher unemployment rate for problem implications, mouthwash for all, free dentist services. Great. Tic Tac stands. Okay, so then we're getting back to the organization. So we currently serve a certain number of residents with halitosis, supporting efforts to decrease halitosis. So maybe our organization serves 80% of our clients have halitosis. So we can weave that in to show that we are already in contact with this population. Is that the last sentence there? Oh, there we go. Internal evaluations have revealed that our strategies to date have been effective in reducing halitosis in this population. So I'm not sure if Janae got all of that. I think she was going to try to fill in our blanks for us and send it. But just a little exercise to show kind of how you can present the problem, where you can put that data in, and then how you bring it back to your organization. So thank you for the example and filling in the blanks.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So now we're going to ask you another question as we're kind of finishing up with our content today. So starting small, it would be amazing for us and for each other if you could share either, off mute or in the chat. What is one thing you can do to improve your grant writing? Yeah, as was mentioned in the chat earlier, I see that many people weren't even familiar with what grant writing is. And so just taking that knowledge back to your organization might be something that you do. If people have been writing grants, it might be, how to incorporate your data in different ways. So I'll just pause here for a moment and leave the floor and space open for anyone who would like to share. Janae has also been able to create that halitosis paragraph if you all like to check it out.
Not my best work, but it should give you at least something you can pull up when you're trying to like really write a powerful needs statement.
And I see Sharon here has shared the chat. Hi, Sharon. We're friends. So
Hello.
hi. So it seems like Sharon shared, never wrote a grant before, but understand the importance of gathering data on what, who, when, where, and why, all the important questions. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing that. Kirsten also shared in the chat here, organize the qualitative data that we have as an organization and as a program, even if it requires a bit of thinking to be used in a grant proposal. Yeah, qualitative data is super important, and you are missing a big piece of the puzzle if you aren't including the real voices of the people who you serve. So that's a great reflection. Thank you. Okay, oh yeah, here we go. Amy here shared, provide more examples of different layers / levels of data. I usually use internal data in King County, but could be good to use Washington data or national data as well in some cases. Yeah, zooming outside of the bubble, we all get very caught up in our tiny little universes, but we're a part of a much bigger system. That's awesome. Lindsay, oh, okay. Lindsay has a question for us. This is great. So I've never written one before. How long is it typically, or does it vary? I can take this one, but once I finish, Janae and Bethany can step in. So it typically, it does vary a lot. It could be very, 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 very long, many, many pages, 50 pages or more. It really depends on the amount of money that it's going to be tied to. Yeah, I don't know. Janae and Bethany, do you have any other reflections on the length?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Well, they often give you a page limit, which can be very helpful. So a lot of the ones I've seen lately, there's like a 12-page limit, which doesn't include the budget and timeline typically. But other ones, they don't give you that limit. And so then it's up to you to kind of reel it in. But I would say it's usually not the state or county level grants. The federal grants can be hundreds of pages. I don't know that that's typically what you'll be going after though.
You know, most applications in the nonprofit space come with some kind of prompt. It's usually pretty clear what they're asking of you. And some of the questions even come with word limits. So they ask you to really, because some folks have a lot to say and some folks have very little to say. And so they try to find the balance between by giving you kind of a word max. So you're not like everyone kind of submits the same length of application. But there's also, they usually don't factor in the things like they often provide you with a budget template, or they'll provide you with like a cover sheet you have to include. So it really depends on who the funder is and what they want. But with length, it's super important that you follow that strictly. Like some funders, they'll open it, and if they say we wanted a 12-page application and it's 13, they will close it or set it aside. So that's one of the key things in grant writing is always to make sure that you follow the instructions, even if they seem arbitrary. Like Bethany and I recently saw a request for proposals that even included the kind of font that they wanted you to use. So it's one of those things when you're writing a grant, just make sure that you're reading every single detail and highlighting and pulling out the things that you need to make sure you're doing.
That's a really good point. I was going to say too, they often will tell you what to name the files. And if you misname a file, they won't even look at your application. So it's really important to, as Janae just said, go through that checklist and make sure you've hit all of your little requirements.
I often have well, I know that in the nonprofit space, it's not possible always to have a grant writing team. But when I was writing grants, I would always have someone be like my second set of eyes. Like, hey, here's the sheet that says that I have to follow all of these requirements. Here's the grant. Can you just make sure that I met all of these requirements? Not read it. You don't have to read the content, but can you just make sure all of these boxes are checked? So it's good to work in a buddy system when you're writing a grant.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you, Lindsay, for that important question. Really got a lot of information out of us. I'll just read a couple more of the comments here before I move on. I see M kind of echoed what Kirsten shared a little earlier about qualitative data. It's not as straightforward as you think. And then Kirsten came in again with keeping the concept of the heart at the forefront of a grant proposal. Wow, that's a beautiful reflection. Yeah, truly an opportunity to tell a story and not really like a formula or solving a puzzle, which is true. They give you a whole bunch of instructions and you got to figure out what they're talking about. Yeah, humanizing it. All right, and then we have another comment from Ben here. I never use human interest info, but would like to explore some ways to do so. Yeah, Bethany, do you have any advice on how to possibly go about human interest in a grant proposal?
Yeah, I think it's just, it depends on your topic, obviously, but to just explain the topic in a more personal way. And if you have that, like some qualitative quotes or data from your participants that reflect this overarching story, that can be really powerful because it takes it out of just this quantitative, 50% of so-and-so has this problem. It's like, no, this 50% of the people have this problem, and this is what that means. This is, this affects every aspect of their life, or, you know, it affects their health and well-being. It affects later in life outcomes, whatever it might be, but really just to show the full story and make it relatable to whoever your reader might be. Janae, do you have anything to add to that?
Dang it, I was on mute. You'd think after all this time that I wouldn't be on mute. No, I was going to say the same thing. Pulling in that human component, making it, speaking about a need at large is sometimes too abstract and too vague. And you kind of get stuck in the specific, the void of something not being there. But when you talk about how it impacts people or communities, or whoever really is the person with the need or the void, that's where it's all at. I mean, and it can be done with numbers, but it's more powerfully done when you have more of a narrative instead of just number, which, I mean, we like, but we also see tremendous value in that story piece.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of centering the voices of the most affected. That's awesome. Great. Well, I will move on to the next slide, which is ironically questions or ideas. So does anyone else have any other questions for us before we close out?
It can be really anything related to grants.
And again, please feel free to use the chat. It's, you know, Thursday afternoon can be a little rough. I'll just pause for 1 minute here.
I guess I have a quick question. I feel like we saw in the needs assessment example how you could plug in numbers, but could one of you speak a little more to how you can incorporate that qualitative data into a grant proposal?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the example that I used on the needs statement slide about a parent identifying a specific need that they had. So in your needs statement, or that kind of like Mad Lib paragraph that we had going, it could be, rather than plug in a statistic, so a percentage or a ratio, you could plug in a story or like something that like provides qualitative context. So saying 25% of the population in King County is impacted, 25% of parents in King County are impacted by isolation. Our program is finding this to be true. In our last needs assessment, one parent identified, this as a particular need in her life. Quote, so you could just like you would weave in the statistics, you weave in the story. And I honestly, it's easier. I find myself wanting to tell the story way more than I am wanting to go find statistics from the census to back up this very particular need for a very specific community. So when you're doing that, just integrate the story, but make sure that you go back and make sure that it's polished, that it's intentional, that it's confidential, that it's ethical, all of those things. But you will, like, especially if you are a person working in program, also writing the grant, your participants, the things they've said, their experiences, the examples you want to pull in. So you're going to find that they kind of naturally start to emerge as you're writing. But like I said, just make sure that you go back and you're really intentional about how you use those.
Thank you.
I will just add that another idea to incorporate qualitative data that's kind of been mentioned, but maybe not explicitly, is kind of taking a step back and looking at different testimonials or information that you've gathered from participants and pulling out the specific themes that you hear again and again. And once you pull out those themes or those things that come up, you can use that to then create quantitative data, right? So as Janae mentioned, like 60% of people mention social isolation, or like 50% of people mentioned that they find it difficult to feed their children during whatever time, X time, so using the qualitative data to then turn it into quantitative is another way to do that. Thank you, Em. Oh, okay, Penny has a question. Are there programs you prefer to use for data collection, etc.? Excel, Tableau? Yeah, there are a lot of different tools out there. and I think it really depends on your program. We have helped people before on Excel, Tableau. We also help people on Airtable with this sort of types of data. It can be helpful to kind of tag or group testimonials and qualitative data in Airtable just because it's more colorful and cute than Excel. I don't know, Janae, Bethany, can you think of any other tools for data collection?
The online survey platforms, if you have those, are pretty good as well. You can, of course, export into Excel or different data formats, but they often provide reports that are pre-generated. And so you can go and they have produced visuals of your data for each question and grouped all of the qualitative data together and that sort of stuff. So it can be easy to just grab and put that in a report or on some slides, whatever your use is. So that's just another one that came to mind for me.
Yeah, and some of those, Bethany, would be like Google Forms or SOGO survey we've used before. Go ahead, Janae.
No, I was going to echo you both and say that any kind of survey data collection tool is really powerful. Some databases have that functionality. Sometimes you do have to use things like Google Forms or a survey software. But one of the reasons that I love using survey for data collection is that you kind of have the opportunity at that point to ask about the confidentiality piece. So right in the survey at the bottom, you can say, do you consent to us using any piece of, your feedback or parts of your testimonial in grant writing? So, or to seek more funding. So it's a powerful tool, especially if you give folks the opportunity to respond anonymously, then you actually don't have to worry about the confidentiality issue at all because you don't know who they are either, as long as you are given permission. Let me think, what else? Yeah, I think most data is usually stored where folks keep their data anyway. So whether that's a database, an Excel, a Google Sheet, wherever that is, it's just a matter of kind of organizing your data in a way that's easy to pull out what you need in times of grant writing, which is a whole other conversation.
You're welcome, Penny. All right. I'll pause one last time for any lingering questions. We are more than happy to answer them. Just hold on one more minute here. Goodbye, Kirsten. Thank you, Lindsay, for your question. Your questions. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your questions and for your time today. We would love to know how it goes. So, we have an evaluation that we would love for you to take if you have the opportunity to. The link is in the chat. And as was mentioned before, we have a number of upcoming workshops, some Excel workshops specifically on the right here. So you can learn more and register at our website here. We would love to see you there. And thank you so much. If you have any other follow-up questions or want to reach out, please email us at our emails. It was so lovely to hang out with you for a little bit of time. And we'll just hang on the call in case there's any lingering questions. But if not, goodbye. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye. See you next time. Goodbye.